AI.Stories presents Lost in the Woods. Ryan had always considered himself an adventurous person, but he'd never been lost in the woods before. It started out innocently enough. He was hiking through the forest, following the trail markers, when he heard a strange noise behind him. Turning around, he saw a group of deer running through the woods, and in his excitement, he chased after them. It wasn't until the sun started to set that Ryan realized he was lost. He retraced his steps, trying to find the trail markers he'd missed, but everything looked the same. Trees towered overhead, their branches blocking out the sky, and the forest floor was carpeted with leaves that rustled underfoot. Ryan's heart pounded as he realized he didn't have a map or a compass. He had no idea which direction to go in, and the woods were getting darker by the minute. He tried to stay calm, to think logically, but fear crept into his mind like a parasite, feeding on his uncertainty. As night fell, Ryan stumbled upon a small clearing. In the center of the clearing was a dilapidated cabin, its windows shattered, its door hanging off its hinges. Ryan hesitated. He'd heard stories about cabins like this, and they never ended well. But the woods were cold, and he was tired and hungry. He pushed open the door, wincing at the creaking sound it made. The cabin was empty, save for a few old pieces of furniture and a fireplace that looked like it hadn't been used in years. Ryan tried to start a fire, but he couldn't find any kindling, so he curled up in a corner, pulling his jacket around him for warmth. It wasn't long before he heard the scratching sound. It was faint at first, barely audible over the crackling of the dead leaves outside. But it grew louder, more insistent, until Ryan was sure something was trying to claw its way through the cabin wall. He sat frozen, staring at the wall as the scratching became a scraping sound. It sounded like something was using its nails to claw through the wood, slowly and deliberately. Ryan tried to convince himself it was just his imagination, but he knew it wasn't. Finally, the scraping stopped. There was a long moment of silence, and then a voice whispered through the cracks in the wall, "I know you're in there." Ryan scrambled to his feet, heart pounding, and bolted out of the cabin. He didn't stop running until he saw the lights of a ranger station in the distance. He stumbled into the station, gasping for breath, and told the rangers what had happened. They went back to the cabin with him, guns drawn, but they found nothing. No one was there, and there were no signs that anyone had been there recently. But Ryan knew what he'd heard, and he never went hiking alone in the woods again.
The Woman in the Fog. It was past midnight, and the teenage couple, Jake and Emily, were driving home from a wild party. The car was warm and cozy, but the thick fog outside sent shivers down their spines. The headlights of their car barely penetrated through the dense mist that had descended out of nowhere. Suddenly, they heard a woman's voice calling for help. "Did you hear that?" the teenage girl asked, turning to her boyfriend who was driving. He nodded.
"Yeah, I heard it too. It sounded like someone was in trouble."
Without wasting any time, he pulled over the car and got out to investigate, leaving his girlfriend alone in the car. As soon as he stepped out, he was engulfed by the mist. The girl waited nervously, her eyes darting between the thick fog outside and the empty road ahead. She tried calling him on his cell phone, but it went straight to voicemail. Just when she thought that she could not wait any longer, the fog suddenly lifted, revealing the deserted road once again. But her boyfriend was nowhere to be seen. She called out his name, but there was no response. Terrified and alone, she sat in the car, waiting for him to return, but he never did. She called the police, but the search for Jake was fruitless. There was no sign of the boy anywhere, and the only evidence they found was a pair of footprints found just off the road that led into the forest. The girl was inconsolable, haunted by the memory of that night and the voice that called out for help in the thick, dense fog. Years later, Emily was driving home from a busy and late night in office. After graduating high school and troubled by the disappearance of her boyfriend, she had moved across the country and was doing quite well. Suddenly, a dense fog blanketed the road. Terrified, she pulled over and locked her doors when a male voice called out in the fog. Emily whispered in disbelief under her breath, "Jake." Something in the window. Jenna had always enjoyed living alone in her cozy little house. She loved the independence and freedom it offered her. However, she began to notice something strange happening every night. When she would turn off the lights and settle in bed, she could see a dark figure standing just outside her window. At first, she thought it was her imagination, or perhaps a trick of the moonlight, but the figure persisted night after night. It stood there, unmoving, and its presence only seemed to grow more ominous and unsettling with each passing night. Jenna tried to rationalize the figure's presence, convincing herself that it was just a shadow or a figment of her imagination. But the fear kept gnawing at her, and she knew she had to confront it. One night, Jenna worked up the courage to peek outside her window, and she saw the figure more clearly than ever before. It was a tall, shadowy figure with eyes that seemed to glow in the darkness. She recoiled in terror and scrambled back to her bed, her heart pounding in her chest. The next night, Jenna resolved to be brave and confront the figure head-on. As she approached the window, the figure suddenly lunged at her, and she screamed in terror. She could feel its cold, skeletal hands reaching out to grab her. Jenna woke up in a cold sweat, realizing that it had all been a nightmare. She looked out the window to reassure herself that the figure was not there, but as she did, she saw a dark, looming figure in the shadows. It was the same figure she had seen in her dreams, and it was now standing in front of her house, watching her.